Lantern light spilled across her bare shoulder, and Caleb Whitaker's hands began to shake. Not from the cold, not from wolves howling outside the cabin walls. He was staring at scars no man was ever meant to see, scars a marriage agency had been paid good money to hide. "Get out," he meant to say. Instead, the words that left his mouth stunned them both, and before dawn broke over that Montana mountain, everything Caleb believed about weakness, about worth, about the trembling woman in front of him, shattered into pieces, he would spend the rest of his life trying to put back together. Before we go any further into Caleb and Evelyn's story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single part of this journey. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every one of them, and I love seeing just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the day the train pulled into Bitter Creek, and the day nobody, least of all Caleb Whitaker, was ready for what stepped off it. The train screamed into Bitter Creek Station a full hour late, and Caleb Whitaker had already decided he hated everything about this day before the first passenger set foot on the platform. He stood apart from the crowd hat, pulled low arms, crossed over a chest built from 10 winters of splitting wood and hauling traps through snow up to his knees. Beside him, the preacher, Reverend Michael Doss, kept glancing sideways, like he expected Caleb to bolt. "You sure about this, son?" Doss asked. "I ain't your son," Caleb said. "And no, I ain't sure about a single part of it." "Then why'd you send the letter?" Caleb's jaw worked. "Because a man can't run 300 acres and a cabin alone forever. Because winter's coming, and I got no one to keep the fire fed if I break my leg checking traps. That's why." "That's a mighty cold reason to marry a woman." "World's a mighty cold place, Reverend. Ain't my job to warm it up." The train's brakes screeched steam, hissing along the platform, and the crowd of Bitter Creek's curious townsfolk pressed forward, the way they always did when the Eastern train came through, half hoping for news, half hoping for gossip. Caleb didn't press forward. He stood his ground, watching the passenger cars, waiting for a face he'd never seen. Holding nothing but a single photograph the agency had sent him, a stiff, formal picture of a woman he'd studied so many nights he could have drawn it blind. Doors opened. Passengers spilled out, a drummer selling tonics, 2 ranch hands returning from Cheyenne, an old woman clutching a birdcage. Caleb's eyes swept past them all, searching. Then she stepped down. She was nothing like the photograph. Not because she was heavier, not because her coat was patched at the elbow and 2 sizes too big, but because the photograph had shown a woman standing straight, chin up, eyes steady at the camera. The woman on the platform kept her eyes on the ground like the wood planks held answers to questions only she could hear. Her hands gripped the handle of a small suitcase so tight her knuckles had gone white. "That her?" Doss asked quietly. Caleb didn't answer right away. He was doing the math a man does without meaning to, sizing up whether a body could survive a mountain winter, whether hands that small could split kindling, whether a woman who couldn't lift her eyes off the ground could stand toe-to-toe with a blizzard and not break. "Reckon it is," he said finally, and the words came out flatter than he meant them. He walked toward her. She heard his boots on the platform and flinched. Actually flinched, like she expected a blow instead of a greeting, before catching herself and forcing her chin up half an inch. "Miss Carter," Caleb said. "Mr. Whitaker." Her voice was soft, careful, like she'd practiced saying his name so it wouldn't shake. He looked at her a long moment. Behind him, he heard the low murmur of the crowd, the particular hush that fell over small towns when they smelled a disappointment in the making. "I was expecting," he started, then stopped himself. "You were expecting someone else," Evelyn said. Not a question. "I was expecting the woman in the letter said could handle a homestead." "I can handle a homestead, Mr. Whitaker. Can you handle a winter that buries the doorframe in snow? Can you handle wolves at the fence line and a well that freezes solid by December?" Evelyn's hands tightened on the suitcase handle. Somewhere behind her, a woman in a bonnet whispered something to her neighbor, and the neighbor laughed low and mean, the kind of laugh meant to be heard. "I can handle more than you think," Evelyn said. and for just a moment something steadied in her voice, something that didn't match the way her shoulders curled inward, like she was trying to take up less space in the world. Caleb studied her face, really looked for the first time, and saw, not fear of him exactly, but fear of something older, something that had nothing to do with mountains or wolves or winter. "The agency said you were widowed," he said. "The agency said a lot of things. That an answer? It's the only one you're getting on a train platform in front of half the county, Mr. Whitaker." That surprised him. He hadn't expected sand in her, not after the flinch, not after the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something else. He wasn't sure what, something sharp, probably something to put distance between them, before distance became unnecessary when the bonneted woman's voice carried clear across the platform. "Guess the Whitaker place is getting a workhorse instead of a wife." Laughter. Not everyone, but enough. Caleb felt his neck go hot, and it surprised him how much it wasn't on his own behalf. He turned slow and found the woman who'd said it, a rancher's wife he half recognized from church he never attended. "You got something to say, Mrs. Petrie, say it to me, not behind a lady's back." The laughter died fast. "I meant no harm, Caleb. Didn't ask what you meant. Asked if you had something to say." He held her eyes until she looked away, cheeks blotching red, and then he turned back to Evelyn, who was staring at him now with an expression he couldn't read, somewhere between confusion and disbelief, like she'd expected him to laugh along. "Wagons this way," he said, and picked up her suitcase before she could protest, surprised at how light it was. A whole life fit into something that weighed less than a sack of flour. They rode in silence for the first hour, the wagon wheels grinding over frozen ruts, the mountains rising ahead of them like a wall the sky had built to keep certain things out and certain things in. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap, spine straight, eyes fixed somewhere past the horse's ears. "You always this quiet?" Caleb finally asked. "You always that rude to a woman you just met?" He almost smiled. Almost. "Didn't think I was rude. Thought I was honest. Honest and rude ain't always different things, Mr. Whitaker, but a man can usually tell which one he's being if he stops to think on it." Fair point. The wind picked up, cutting down off the peaks with a bite that made the horses toss their heads. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter, and Caleb couldn't help but notice that she didn't complain. Didn't ask him to stop. Didn't ask for a blanket. She just set her jaw and endured it the way a woman does when she's spent a long time learning that asking for comfort gets her nothing but more reasons to be ashamed of needing it. "Cold?" he asked. "I'm fine." Didn't ask if you were fine, asked if you were cold. She looked at him, then surprised, like the distinction hadn't occurred to her that a man might ask a real question instead of a polite one. "Yes," she admitted. "I'm cold." Caleb reached behind the seat, pulled out a wool blanket he kept for the horses in case of trouble on the trail, and dropped it into her lap without a word. She stared at it a moment before pulling it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quiet. "Don't thank me. Just don't want you froze solid before you've done a lick of work." It was meant as a joke, a rough one, the only kind he knew how to make. But Evelyn's face closed up again, and Caleb realized too late how the words had landed. He opened his mouth to take them back somehow, but the wagon hit a deep rut at that exact moment and lurched hard, throwing them both sideways, and the moment for softening anything passed. They didn't speak again until the wagon wheel dropped into a snow-hidden hole 2 miles from the cabin, and the whole rig shuddered to a stop, the front axle groaning under a weight it wasn't built to hold at that angle. "Blast it!" Caleb muttered, jumping down into snow that came up past his knees. He circled the wagon, saw the wheel wedged sideways in a rut, frozen solid beneath fresh powder, and felt the first real worry of the day settle into his gut. Losing daylight out here with a broken wagon wasn't a mistake. It was a death sentence dressed up as an inconvenience. "I need you to hold the horses steady," he called up. "Can you do that?" Evelyn was already climbing down, blanket falling away, suitcase forgotten in the wagon bed. "I asked if you could hold the horses," Caleb said again, sharper. "I heard you. I'm not holding horses while you break your back alone in a ditch." She moved to the wheel before he could argue, crouching down in the snow, without a hint of the hesitation she'd shown on the platform, running her bare hands along the spokes, testing the angle. "It ain't cracked," she said. "Just wedged. You get under the axle and lift. I'll pack snow under the wheel so it's got something to grip when it comes free." Caleb stared at her. "You know wagons? I know a wheel that's stuck ain't a wheel that's broke. Now are we standing here talking, or are we getting this thing out before dark?" He didn't answer. He got under the axle. It took the better part of 20 minutes, Caleb heaving with everything he had, while Evelyn packed frozen snow into the rut with her bare hands, her fingers gone red and raw, guiding the wheel with quiet, sharp instructions that surprised him every time she gave one. When the wheel finally lurched free and the wagon rocked upright, Caleb sat back in the snow, breathing hard, and looked at her. Really looked the way he hadn't on the platform. Her hands were shaking from the cold. Her hem was soaked through, and she was smiling small and startled, like she hadn't expected to succeed at something, and was almost embarrassed by how good it felt. "Where'd a woman learn to free a wagon wheel?" he asked. The smile vanished. "Someplace I don't talk about." She climbed back into the wagon without another word, and Caleb stood there a moment in the snow, feeling like he'd stepped on something without meaning to. Some old wound buried just under the surface of her, and not knowing what to do except climb up beside her and drive on. The cabin came into view as the light started dying, a squat, solid shape against the tree line. Smoke long gone cold from the stove windows. Dark. Caleb watched Evelyn take it in, watched her eyes move over the sagging porch step, the woodpile half collapsed against the north wall, the general look of a place that had been lived in, but never truly kept. "It ain't much," he said, an apology that wasn't quite an apology. "It's got 4 walls and a roof. I've lived in worse." Something in the way she said it made him glance at her, but her face had already gone smooth and closed again, and he didn't push. Inside, he showed her the cabin in short clipped sentences. Stove here, water barrel there. The loft where she'd sleep, the main room where he slept, a line drawn between them, without either of them saying it out loud. Evelyn listened, nodded, asked no questions, and the moment he finished, she was already moving. Unpacking a crate of preserves that had gone disorganized on the shelf, resetting jars by size, checking dates scrawled in chalk on the lids. "These are turning," she said, holding up a jar of something brown and cloudy. "You've been eating spoiled preserves half the winter, I'd wager. Ain't had time to sort them." "Well, you've got time now." She said it without malice, just fact, and set the jar aside with 3 others gone bad, then turned to the rest of the shelf like a general surveying a battlefield. By the time full dark fell, she'd reorganized the entire pantry, mended a tear in his only spare coat she'd found draped over a chair, and gotten a fire built high enough to warm the whole cabin, all without being asked, all without a single complaint about her frozen hands or the long day behind her. Caleb sat at the table watching her work, feeling something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet and wasn't ready to look at too closely. "You didn't have to do all that tonight," he said. "Man's got to eat something that ain't spoiled tomorrow. Didn't seem like a task that could wait." She wiped her hands on her apron, the one she'd found and put on, without asking, like she already understood this was her place now, however uncertain the rest of it felt. "I'll need to know where you keep the flour, and whether that stove draws right or if it smokes when the wind comes from the north." "Smokes something fierce from the north. Then I'll bank the fire different when the wind shifts. Fixed worse stoves than that." Caleb almost asked where the question rose up automatic, the same curiosity that had gotten him a locked door at the wagon wheel. But he caught himself this time and said nothing. And something about his silence made Evelyn glance at him with an expression close to gratitude. Supper was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Not exactly. Evelyn had turned a handful of ordinary supplies into something that tasted like more than survival. And Caleb found himself watching her across the table with a wary kind of curiosity he hadn't expected to feel on the first night. "You're not what I thought you'd be," he admitted halfway through the meal. "You said that already, on the platform, in front of half the town." "I know. I'm saying it different now." Evelyn looked up at him. Fork paused. "Different how?" I thought I was getting a woman too soft for this place. Turns out you fixed a wagon wheel with your bare hands and reorganized a winter's worth of preserves before sundown." He shook his head. "Don't know what I was expecting. Not that." Something flickered across her face, pleasure quickly hidden, like she wasn't sure it was safe to let it show. "I told you. I can handle more than you think." "Startin' to believe you." They finished the meal in a silence that felt different than the one on the wagon. Not empty, but full of things neither of them had words for yet. When Evelyn moved to clear the plates, Caleb caught the way she favored her right side slightly, the way she held her left arm just a fraction closer to her body than the right, and he almost said something before deciding it wasn't his business, not yet. Maybe not ever. Night came down hard and full outside, the kind of dark that swallowed the cabin whole and left nothing but firelight and the sound of wind testing the walls for weakness. Caleb banked the fire while Evelyn readied the loft, and when he came to check the door was barred, he found her already changed for bed, wrapped tight in a shawl despite the warmth of the fire, sitting on the edge of the small bed he'd set up near the hearth. For her, closer to the warmth than the loft, a small kindness he hadn't announced just done. "I'll sleep by the door tonight," he said, "case anything comes sniffing round the stalk." "All right." He turned to bank the last of the fire. And that's when it happened. A log shifted, sparked, and the sudden flare of light caught Evelyn off guard as she reached to adjust the shawl slipping from her shoulder. For half a second, no more the fabric fell away from her collarbone, and the lantern light caught what she'd spent years keeping hidden, a long pale scar tracing down from her shoulder. Twisting and knotted, the unmistakable mark of something that had torn through skin and never healed clean. Evelyn gasped and yanked the shawl back up so fast the motion nearly knocked the lantern from the table. Caleb froze. He'd seen it only for a heartbeat less, but a heartbeat was enough. His mind was already turning it over, trying to make sense of a mark that deep, that old, that deliberate looking, and none of the explanations his mind offered him were good ones. "Evelyn." His voice came out rough. "Don't." Her voice cracked on the single word, and she turned her face away from him, shoulders drawn up tight, every line of her body braced for something. "Don't ask. Please. Just don't ask." I know what you saw." Her voice was barely above a whisper now, and it shook in a way her voice hadn't shaken all day. Not on the platform, not with Mrs. Petrie's cruelty ringing across it, not even wrestling a wagon wheel out of frozen mud with her bare hands. "I know exactly what you saw, Mr. Whitaker, and I know what you're thinking right now, and I'd rather you just say it than sit there looking at me like that." "I ain't thinking anything yet. I don't even know what I saw." "You saw enough." Caleb set the fire iron down slow, careful the way a man moves around something wounded and unpredictable. "Then tell me what it is. Plain. However bad it is, I'd rather hear it from you than sit here guessing." Evelyn was quiet a long moment, her back still to him, shoulders rising and falling with breath she was working hard to control. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone flat, stripped of everything except the bare bones of what she'd clearly rehearsed saying maybe 100 times, maybe never once out loud until now. 6 years ago I was married. Not the way people mean when they say it kindly. I was owned is closer to the truth of it. My husband believed a wife who didn't please him fast enough, didn't obey, quick enough, didn't stay quiet enough, had it coming to her. The scar you saw is from the year I finally stopped being quiet. She turned then, and her eyes when they met his were dry. But there was nothing calm behind them, just a terrible practiced steadiness. The kind a person builds when falling apart has stopped being an option. "There's more than one, if that matters to you." Caleb didn't move. Couldn't for a moment, the words landing in him like something physical, something that knocked the air clean out of his chest. "He's the reason I can't have children." Evelyn went on before he could speak, like she needed to get all of it out now or never say it at all. "The doctor in Cheyenne told me that plain no kindness in how he said it, like it was a fact about a mule and not a woman. The agency knew. I told them everything because I wasn't going to lie to a man about to marry me. And they told me plain as anything, that if I mentioned any of it, no man west of the Mississippi would have me. Said to keep the scars covered, keep my past covered, and let the marriage happen before the truth had a chance to ruin it. Her chin lifted defiant, even as her voice threatened to break. So there it is, Mr. Whitaker. That's your workhorse wife. Damaged goods with a story too ugly for polite conversation. Don't call yourself that. Why not? It's true. It ain't true, and I ain't having you say it in my house. Something in his voice, sharper than he meant it, edged with an anger that had nowhere else to go, made Evelyn flinch. Actually flinch the same way she had on the platform, and Caleb saw it land and hated himself instantly for putting it there. I'm not angry at you, he said, quieter now, though the anger was still moving through him, like something with no clear target casting around for somewhere to go and finding nothing but his own reflection in the dark window. I'm angry that a man did that to you. I'm angry an agency knew and sent you here anyway without a word of warning, like you were cargo instead of a person. I'm angry at myself some for the things I said on that platform, the things I was thinking, before I knew a single true thing about you. You don't have to say that to make this easier. I ain't saying it to make it easier. I'm saying it because it's true, and you deserve true things said to you, even the hard ones. He raked a hand through his hair, feeling something come loose in his chest, that he didn't have words for, something too big for the cabin, too big for the night. I wanted a wife, because I wanted help getting through winter. I wanted children because I wanted this place to mean something after I'm gone. I never once thought about what she'd have survived to get here. Never once asked. You're asking now. I'm asking now. He looked at her, at the scar hidden again beneath the shawl, at the steady defiance in her eyes, even with her voice shaking, and felt something in his chest crack wide open in a way 10 years of mountain winters had never managed. And I don't know what to do with what you just told me. I don't know how a man's supposed to hear a thing like that and just go on like it's supper conversation. Then don't, Evelyn said, and for the first time that night her voice cracked clean through. Don't pretend you can hear it and not have it change how you look at me. I've seen that look before, Mr. Whitaker. I know exactly what comes after it. You don't know what's in my head. I know what's usually in a man's head when he learns a woman's broken. You ain't broken! The words came out of him harder than he intended, almost a shout, and he saw her flinch again and forced himself to breathe, to slow down, to say the rest of it plain. You fixed a wagon wheel today with your bare hands in the snow. You reorganized a winter's worth of food before you'd even had your first meal in this house. You've got more sand in you than any man I've met in 10 years up this mountain, and you're sitting there telling me you're broken like it's a fact carved in stone. Then what would you call it? Her voice broke fully now, all the careful steadiness giving way at once, tears finally coming, the first she'd let him see all day. What do you call a woman who can't give a man children, who flinches at raised voices, who still wakes up some nights certain she's back there, certain none of the years since were real? Tell me what word you'd use for that, Mr. Whitaker, because I've run out of gentle ones. Caleb stood there in the firelight chest, heaving like he'd run the whole way up the mountain instead of ridden it, every instinct in him pulling two directions at once toward her and away. Shame and tenderness tangled together so tight he couldn't tell where one ended and the other started. He opened his mouth to answer her, to say something that might undo even a fraction of the damage 6 years and one careless agency had done, and found he had no words worth saying yet, nothing that wouldn't sound cheap set against what she'd just handed him. So instead, he grabbed his coat off the hook by the door, hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold, and walked out into the freezing dark without a single word of explanation, leaving Evelyn standing alone by the dying fire, certain in the silence that followed that she'd just watched her marriage end on its very first night. The wind hit Caleb like a fist the moment he cleared the porch, and for the first 10 steps he welcomed it. He wanted the cold. He wanted something outside his own skull to fight, because everything inside his skull right now was a mess. He didn't know how to untangle. Evelyn's voice cracking on the word broken. The scar catching lantern light for half a heartbeat, 6 years of a word he never wanted to say out loud again. Husband. He walked without a direction, which was the first mistake, and he knew it was the first mistake even as he made it, because a man who'd survived 10 winters on this mountain didn't walk blind into a storm building at his back. But his boots kept moving anyway, crunching through drifts, already knee-deep snow, needling sideways into his collar. And somewhere behind him, the cabin window glowed small and orange, and impossibly far away, faster than it should have. "Stupid," he muttered to himself. "Stupid, stupid." He wasn't sure if he meant the walking or the words he'd failed to say back in that cabin. Maybe both. He kept moving. The wind screamed harder through the pines, and Caleb realized with the particular clarity that comes right before real trouble that he could no longer see the shape of his own woodline. Snow had come up thick and fast, faster than any storm had a right to move this early in the season, swallowing the moon whole, swallowing every landmark he'd used for 10 years to find his way home in the dark. "All right," he said out loud, forcing his voice level, forcing his mind to work the way it worked, when a trap sprung wrong, or a horse went lame 3 miles from the barn. "All right, cabin's east. Wind's coming from the north. Keep the wind on your left shoulder, you'll find the tree line." He turned, put the wind where he wanted it, and started walking with purpose now, instead of shame. That should have worked. It had worked before a dozen times in storms just as mean as this one. It didn't work this time, because 10 minutes later, his boot caught a root buried under snow he couldn't see. And the whole world tilted sideways. And Caleb Whitaker, 10 years surviving alone on this mountain. A man who prided himself on never once needing rescuing went down hard onto a stone hidden beneath the drift. And something in his ankle gave with a sound he felt more than heard. Pain shot up his leg white hot. And for a moment, he just lay there. Snow already collecting on his eyelashes. Breath coming ragged, the storm howling overhead like it had been waiting for exactly this. "Get up," he told himself. "Get up, Whitaker." He got up. He put weight on the ankle and nearly went down again, a sound tearing out of him that was half curse, half something raw. He tried again slower, using a fallen branch as a crutch, and managed 3 steps before the wind changed direction entirely, screaming down off a different slope now. And Caleb realized with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature that he no longer had any idea which way was east. Back at the cabin, Evelyn had not moved from the spot by the fire for a long time. She'd told herself at first that he needed air. Men needed air sometimes after hard truths. She'd learned that lesson once, learned it the hard way, learned that a woman who chased a man's temper into a storm usually regretted it. So she sat. She waited. She told herself he'd be back in 10 minutes, cold enough to have cooled whatever was burning in him, ready to say something final and quiet that would end this marriage before it had properly begun. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The wind outside had gone from bad to something worse, something that rattled the shutters and found every gap in the log walls, and Evelyn felt the first hard knot of fear form low in her stomach. Not fear of him anymore, but fear for him, which was a different animal entirely, and caught her off guard with how fast it arrived. She went to the window. Nothing but white churning and endless, no sign of a man-shaped shadow anywhere in it. "He knows this mountain," she said out loud to no one to convince herself. "He's lived here 10 years. He'll come back when he's ready." But the wind screamed louder, and something in her chest, something old, something that remembered exactly what it felt like to wait in a house for a man who might or might not come back. Might come back. Changed might not come back. Kind twisted hard enough that she pressed a hand flat against her ribs, like she could hold the fear in by force. She thought of the scar. She thought of 6 years of learning that the safest thing a woman could do was stay put, stay quiet, not go looking for trouble in a storm. Then she thought of the way Caleb's voice had cracked when he said, "You ain't broken the raw honesty in it. Nothing practiced or polite." And she made a decision that surprised her more than it should have. She grabbed the lantern. She grabbed the wool blanket he'd given her in the wagon. She wrapped herself in every layer the cabin had to offer, and she stepped out into a storm that could kill a woman half as stubborn as she was, because some new and terrifying part of her had already decided that losing this man to pride and snow was a worse outcome than anything 6 years of marriage to a cruel one had taught her to fear. "Caleb!" Her voice tore away in the wind almost before it left her mouth. "Caleb Whitaker, you answer me. Nothing but white and howling dark. She pressed forward anyway, one hand on the cabin wall, as long as she could keep contact with it, using it as an anchor. The way she remembered a trapper once telling a room full of strangers years ago, always keep one hand on something solid, or the storm will turn you around inside 3 steps, and you won't even know it's happened. When the wall ended, she was alone in the white, with nothing but the lantern's small orange circle and her own voice. And for the first time since stepping outside, real terror closed cold fingers around her throat. Caleb. Somewhere ahead, she couldn't tell how far the wind stole all sense of distance. She heard it. Faint. A voice, or maybe just the storm playing tricks, the way storms did on the desperate. Here. The word barely carried. Here, she followed it. She had no better plan than that. No compass but a voice fighting through wind that wanted to swallow it whole, and she stumbled forward through drifts that pulled at her skirts, like hands trying to hold her back, until the lantern light finally caught something dark against the snow. That wasn't a tree, wasn't a rock, was a man half buried and struggling to rise on an ankle that clearly wouldn't hold him. Caleb. She dropped to her knees beside him, lantern swinging wild light across his face, and found him white-lipped, shaking snow, already crusting in his eyebrows. You shouldn't have, he started, teeth chattering hard enough to break the words apart. Shouldn't have come out here, it ain't. Hush. She was already working her hands under his arm, hauling with a strength that surprised them both. Hush and stand up, or so help me I will leave you in this snow to think about your pride. Despite everything. The cold, the pain, the ankle screaming with every attempt at weight. Something close to a laugh cracked out of Caleb, short and disbelieving. You wouldn't. Try me and find out. He tried standing. The ankle buckled again, and this time he didn't fight the sound that tore out of him. It's broke, he ground out. Or close to it. Then you'll lean on me and we'll go slow, and you will not argue about it. Evelyn got his arm across her shoulders, braced her legs wide in the drift, and heaved upward with everything she had. Which way's the cabin? I don't. He stopped, swallowed, admitted something that clearly cost him more than the ankle did. I don't rightly know. Lost the wall in the dark. For one terrible second, Evelyn felt the fear spike sharp and total. 2 people, 1 lantern, a storm that didn't care about either of their names, and no certain way home. Then she made herself breathe, made herself think past the panic the way she'd had to think past panic more times in her life than she cared to count. Wind's coming from the north, she said. You told me that yourself back on the wagon when you said it'd smoke the stove. Cabin door faces south away from it. So we keep the wind at our backs, and we walk straight, and we do not stop, and we do not let go of each other. Understand? Caleb stared at her through the snow, crusting his lashes, something shifting behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the cold. Understand? He said. They walked. Every step was a negotiation between his ruined ankle and her failing strength, the lantern swinging wild shadows across drifts that all looked the same. And twice, Evelyn felt her own knees threaten to buckle under his weight, and twice she found some reserve she hadn't known was in her and kept moving anyway. Talk to me, she said when his head started to loll dangerously against her shoulder. Caleb, talk to me. Don't you dare go quiet on me now. About what? Anything. Your family. Anything at all. Just keep your voice going. He was quiet a long moment, boots dragging, and Evelyn's heart slammed hard against her ribs, thinking she'd lost him to the cold, slow pull already, and then he spoke, voice rough and slurred, but there. Had a wife. Once. Before you. The words came hard, like each one cost something. Sarah. Fever took her second winter up here. Took the baby with her before it ever drew breath. Evelyn's chest cracked open at that grief and understanding colliding in her all at once. Caleb. Buried them both under that big pine east of the cabin. Been alone up here since. Told myself I didn't need help. Told myself a hired hand or a strong back was all I was after when I sent that letter to the agency. Didn't let myself think past that. He stumbled, caught himself, kept moving. Didn't let myself think about needing anything past a strong back, because needing more than that got me buried under a pine tree once already, and I wasn't fixing to feel that again. The confession hung between them in the screaming wind, and Evelyn understood with a sudden terrible clarity exactly what kind of man she'd married. Not cruel, not cold by nature, just a man who'd built a wall so high around his own grief that he'd convinced himself wanting nothing was safer than wanting something and losing it. "That's why you looked at me the way you did," she said. On the platform. "That's why. You weren't looking at me at all. You were looking at every reason not to need anyone again." He didn't answer, but the silence answered for him, and Evelyn found the strength for one more push through the drift, dragging them both toward a shape finally taking form out of the white, a wall, a window glowing faint orange salvation close enough now that her legs nearly gave out from the relief of it. "There," she gasped. "There, Caleb, we made it." They half fell through the cabin door together, snow blasting in behind them, before Evelyn kicked it shut with the last of her strength, and Caleb collapsed against the wall, breath tearing out of him in great white clouds, ankle finally allowed to fail, now that the danger had passed. "Don't move," Evelyn ordered, already shrugging out of her soaked coat. "Don't you dare move that leg." Wasn't planning to. She worked fast. Fire built higher water set to heat his boot, cut away from a swollen ankle, already going purple-black at the joint. And through all of it, Caleb watched her hands move with a competence that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with practice. The same steady certainty she'd shown at the wagon wheel that afternoon. "Where'd you learn this?" he asked, voice still rough from the cold. "Same place you learned wagon wheels." Evelyn's hands stilled for half a second over his ankle, before continuing their work, wrapping a strip of torn cloth tight and sure. "My father broke his leg when I was 14. Doctor was 3 days right away. I learned fast, or I watched him suffer for want of learning." She tied off the wrap and sat back on her heels, finally letting herself breathe. "Turns out, fast learning is a skill a body keeps whether she wants to or not." "Seems like you got a lot of skills a body keeps. Seems like you're feverish and talking foolish." But there was no bite in it, and when she looked up and caught him watching her with something that wasn't the wary, calculating look from the train platform, something warmer, something that looked dangerously close to wonder. Her breath caught in a way the cold outside had nothing to do with. "I owe you an apology," Caleb said, "for walking out like that, for not staying to hear the rest of what you needed to say, for near about getting myself killed, proving I didn't need anybody's help, when the truth is, I've needed help for 10 years and been too stubborn and too scared to admit it. You don't have to say that tonight. You're cold and hurting and half out of your mind with it. I mean every word, cold or not." He reached out slow, giving her every chance to pull away, and closed his hand gently over hers where it still rested against the bandage. "You came out into that storm for me, after everything I said, after everything you told me, and I walked out on. You came out anyway. I wasn't going to let a stubborn mountain man freeze to death over his own pride." Her voice wavered, betraying more than the joking words let on. "That'd make me a widow twice in one lifetime, and I don't much care for the arithmetic of it." Caleb almost smiled, the first real one she'd seen from him. Small and tired, but genuine, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Just sat there in the firelight with his hand over hers. The storm still howling outside a wall that finally felt like it might hold against more than just weather. "Evelyn." "Yes, I don't think you're broken. I need you to hear that plain, not half froze and slurring it like I was outside. I think you're the strongest person I've met on this mountain, and that includes every trapper and miner and fool who's tried to winter here alone. What that man did to you, that's a stain on him. Not you, never you." Her eyes filled and she looked away fast, blinking hard, unwilling to let the tears fall even now. "You don't know that yet. You've known me one day. Don't need 10 years to know courage when I've watched it drag me half a mile through a blizzard." He squeezed her hand, once gentle. Give me time to prove the rest of it. That's all I'm asking. Time. Evelyn looked back at him, something in her chest loosening for the first time in 6 long years, some knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying every single day since the last time a man raised his voice and she flinched from it. "All right," she whispered. "Time." The fire cracked and settled between them, and for a while, that was enough. No more words needed, just the quiet understanding that something had shifted between them in that storm. Something neither of them was ready to name, but both of them had felt all the same. Morning came gray and quiet. The storm blown itself out some time before dawn, snow piled deep and clean against every wall of the cabin. Caleb woke to find Evelyn already up, ankle splint checked and rewrapped, with fresh cloth coffee brewing on a stove she'd somehow gotten drawing right despite the wind direction she'd worried over the night before. "You're supposed to be resting that leg," she said without turning from the stove, though there was no real scold in it. Man can rest sitting up, same as lying down. Man can also do as he's told for once in his fool life. But she brought him coffee anyway, careful of the leg propped on a stool. And when their fingers brushed passing the cup, neither of them pulled away quite as fast as manners might have called for. "Ankle's not broke," Caleb said, testing a small shift of weight and wincing. "Wrenched bad, but not broke. Give it a week. A week you'll spend sitting right there, or I'll wrap you to that chair myself." Bossy. Practical. She sat across from him with her own coffee, and for the first time since the platform, there was an ease between them that had nothing forced about it. "Someone's got to keep this homestead standing while you're laid up. Reckon that someone's you." "Reckon it is." They fell into a rhythm over the days that followed, Caleb hobbling on the mend, giving instructions from a chair he grumbled about, but obeyed Evelyn, taking to the outdoor chores with a determination that left him equal parts humbled and impressed. She split kindling one-handed while balancing an armload already gathered. She mended the sagging porch step with nails and boards scavenged from the woodpile, and when Caleb offered advice from the doorway, she waved him off with a look that told him plainly she didn't need it. "You keep doing that," he said one afternoon, watching her drive a nail true with 3 clean strikes. "Folks in town are going to wonder which one of us is the rancher." "Let them wonder." She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow, despite the cold, and for a moment, something like real happiness crossed her face. Small surprised, like she hadn't expected to feel it here in this place, with this man. "First time in a long while I've done work and had someone thank me for it, instead of finding fault. Ain't found fault with a single thing you've done since that platform. Give it time." But she was smiling when she said it, and Caleb found himself smiling back before he'd decided to something loosening in his own chest that had been locked tight since a pine tree east of the cabin took everything he thought he'd wanted from this life. It was on the 5th day, with Caleb finally testing weight on the mended ankle, and Evelyn stacking the last of the split wood against the north wall, that the sound of hooves on the frozen trail brought them both around fast, wary the way anyone living this far from town learned to be wary of unexpected visitors. A rider came into view, not a rancher, not anyone Caleb recognized from Bitter Creek's usual faces, but a man in a dark coat too fine for mountain work, sitting a horse too well groomed for the trail he'd just ridden. "Help you!" Caleb called, moving to stand between the rider and Evelyn, without quite meaning to an instinct he didn't examine too closely. The rider reined up, tipped his hat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Whitaker, is it? Caleb Whitaker?" "Depends who's asking." "Silas Grayson. I'm a surveyor working for the Northern Pacific Line. Come to let you know the railroad's looking at routes through this stretch of the territory, and your parcel here happens to sit right in the middle of the most sensible one." Something cold settled in Caleb's stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "This land's mine, filed and patented 8 years back." Sure. Grayson's smile widened, easy and practiced. "Nobody's disputing your paper, Whitaker. Just here to talk terms. Railroad pays fair money for right-of-way, and there's more than a few homesteaders round these parts finding it a sight easier to sell outright than fight a line that's coming through one way or another. And if a man don't want to sell..." Grayson's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went flat and calculating in a way that made Evelyn, watching from the woodpile, go very still. Well now, Grayson said, that'd be a shame. Railroads got ways of finding the most economical route, and sometimes that route runs straight through a parcel, whether the fella holding the deed wants it to or not. Easier on everybody if we settle friendly-like before any surveying disputes get filed with the land office. Surveying disputes, boundary questions. Happens more than you'd think out here where the original surveys were done quick and rough 20 years back. A man might find his patent don't sit quite where he thought it did once a proper survey's run through. Grayson reached into his coat, produced a folded paper, held it out with a casualness that felt anything but casual. Just a preliminary offer. Take a look, talk it over with the little lady there, and I'll be back through in a week's time for your answer. Caleb took the paper with a jaw set hard enough to ache, watched Grayson tip his hat once more, and turn his horse back down the trail without waiting for further conversation, and stood there a long moment in the cold staring after him. Caleb. Evelyn had come up beside him, dropping the wood she'd been carrying, eyes fixed on the paper in his hand. What was that? Trouble, Caleb said. That was trouble dressed up nice and riding a good horse. He unfolded the paper right there in the yard, and Evelyn leaned in to read over his shoulder, and something in the careful legal language, the kind designed to look official while saying almost nothing plain, made her frown deepen with every line. This offer, she said slowly, it's low, real low, for good bottomland with a water source. You can tell that from a glance. I can tell figures don't match figures when I see them not matching. She took the paper from his hands, turning it toward better light eyes, moving fast and sharp over the numbers in a way that surprised him all over again. The same competence that had freed a wagon wheel and organized a pantry, now turning itself toward something far more dangerous. And this bit here about the boundary survey, that's not how a legitimate right-of-way offer reads. That's how a man reads when he's laying groundwork to claim your patent don't cover what you think it covers. You know legal paper? Evelyn's hands went still on the document, and for a moment the old caution flickered back into her eyes, the same wariness from the platform, like she'd revealed more of herself than she'd meant to. I worked as a clerk, she said finally carefully. Before. Land Records Office in Cheyenne before I was married. Filed patents, recorded surveys, watched enough boundary disputes cross that desk to know what a man looks like when he's building a case instead of making an honest offer. Caleb stared at her, something recalculating fast behind his eyes. The wagon wheel, the pantry, the mended coat. And now this. A woman who'd spent years reading exactly the kind of document now sitting folded in her hand, a woman the agency had called fragile and unfit for mountain life. Evelyn Carter, he said slowly. Just what all did that agency fail to mention about you? Plenty, she said, and for the first time there was something almost like humor threading through the tension, dark and dry. Seems like we're both finding out who we actually married, one secret at a time. This one might be the useful kind. This one, Evelyn said, folding the paper with sudden, sharp decisiveness, might be the kind that saves this whole homestead if Silas Grayson is half as crooked as I think he is. Caleb looked at the document in her hand, then at her steady, now focused the fear that had colored her every movement on that train platform, replaced by something fierce and certain, and felt something in his chest turn over entirely, some final piece of the doubt he'd carried since the platform crumbling away for good. Then I reckon, he said, we'd best find out exactly what Mr. Grayson's hiding before he comes back through in a week. Evelyn met his eyes, and something passed between them that was neither fully trust nor fully partnership yet, but was closer to both than anything that had existed between them a week before. I reckon we'd best, she agreed, and turned toward the cabin with the paper still in her hand, already thinking, already working the problem. The way she'd worked every problem this mountain had thrown at her since the moment she stepped off that train. Not as a woman waiting to be saved, but as one already halfway to saving something herself. Behind her, Caleb watched her go. Ankle forgotten cold, forgotten, and understood with sudden and total clarity that whatever the agency had sent him, whatever he'd expected walking onto that platform a week ago, he had gotten something else entirely. something he was only now painfully and gratefully beginning to recognize as exactly what he'd needed all along. The days that followed took on a new shape, one built around the folded document Evelyn kept tucked inside her sewing basket, studied by lamplight. After the evening chores were done, her sharp eyes tracing figures and clauses, while Caleb sat across from her, ankle-propped, learning more about land patents and survey law in a handful of evenings than he'd learned in 8 years of holding his own deed. "Here," Evelyn said on the third night, tapping a line near the bottom of the page. "This clause. It don't name a specific boundary dispute. It just reserves the railroad's right to file one contingent on a resurvey they say they'll commission independently. That's not standard right-of-way language. That's a man leaving himself room to claim whatever boundary suits him best once he's got a surveyor in his pocket willing to draw the line where he wants it drawn. You saying Grayson means to steal land outright? I'm saying I've seen this exact trick before. Cheyenne 4 years back, young rancher couple, hardly older than newlyweds, got a visit from a rail agent talking real friendly about right-of-way. When they didn't sell quick enough, a resurvey turned up, and suddenly their patent boundary sat 40 acres shy of where they'd built their whole operation. By the time they'd scraped together money for a lawyer, the railroad already owned the disputed strip free and clear, bought at auction from the land office after the original patent got voided for boundary discrepancy. Evelyn's voice had gone hard flat, the voice of someone reciting an old wound rather than a distant memory. I filed the paperwork on that case myself. Watched it happen from behind a clerk's desk and couldn't do a blessed thing to stop it. That why you left Cheyenne? That's one of several reasons. She didn't elaborate further, and Caleb, learning the shape of her silences, now didn't push. So what do we do? He asked instead. If Grayson's aiming to run that same trick on us? Evelyn was quiet a moment, turning the paper over in her hands, some old fire kindling behind her eyes that had nothing to do with fear at all. We beat him to the land office, she said. We get our own surveyor out here, an honest one, before Grayson's man ever sets foot on this property with his own instruments. We get the boundary documented plain and certified, filed, and recorded before he's got a chance to claim any discrepancy exists at all. That kind of surveyor cost money. Money we ain't exactly got sitting spare. Then we find another way. Evelyn's chin lifted that same defiant tilt he'd first seen on the train platform, except now it wasn't defending against judgment, it was aimed square at a fight she'd apparently decided without asking him that she intended to win. I still know men in Cheyenne. Men who owe me favors from my clerking days, who'd remember exactly what kind of operation the Northern Pacific runs when it wants land it hasn't paid honest price for. I can write letters. I can find us an honest man willing to ride out here for less than Grayson's counting on us being able to afford. Caleb watched her across the lamplight. This woman he'd judged too soft for mountain life on a train platform, not 2 weeks past now, sitting straight-backed and fierce, already 3 moves ahead of a scheme that had probably already ruined a dozen homesteads across this territory, and felt something in his chest that he was only beginning to have words for. You're something else, Evelyn Carter. I'm something scared. She corrected quietly, some of the fire banking down for just a moment, honesty slipping through the cracks. I've watched good people lose everything to men like Grayson. I won't watch it happen here. Not to this place. Not to you. Not to us, Caleb said, and watched her eyes lift to his, surprised by the word, by the quiet certainty in how he'd said it. Not to us, she agreed, soft, and something passed between them in that lamplit cabin that felt less like 2 strangers navigating a marriage of convenience, and more like 2 people who had somewhere in the last week's storm and struggle become something neither of them had quite dared name yet. Partners in every sense that mattered, bound now by more than a piece of paper, signed in front of a preacher, bound by a fight they'd chosen together to face. Outside, the wind had gone quiet for the first time in days, the mountain settling into a stillness that felt for just a moment like held breath, as though even the land itself understood that Silas Grayson would be riding back up that trail within the week, and that whatever answer he found waiting for him would set in motion something far larger than either Caleb or Evelyn yet understood. The letter to Cheyenne went out on a Tuesday, Carried by a rider Caleb trusted enough to pay in coin and silence, and for 6 days afterward, Evelyn found herself counting hours the way she used to count them in another house, another life, waiting on something that might change everything, afraid to hope too hard, in case hoping was its own kind of foolishness. "You keep looking at that trail like it owes you money," Caleb said on the 4th morning, watching her pause mid-stride with an armload of firewood eyes fixed on the empty ribbon of frozen dirt winding down toward the valley. "I'm not looking at anything. You've looked at that trail 11 times since sunup. I counted." "Well, somebody's got to keep watch since you're still favoring that ankle like an old man with the gout. Ankle's fine." It wasn't not fully. But Caleb had stopped arguing the point days ago because arguing with Evelyn Carter had become, in the space of 2 short weeks, one of the more entertaining pursuits he'd found on this mountain in years. "You're stalling. Admit it." "I'm not stalling. I'm working." "You're stalling and working, both at once. Impressive, really." Evelyn shot him a look that might have been a glare on anyone else but on her, had gone soft at the edges, something warm hiding just beneath the irritation. And Caleb felt that particular tug in his chest that had become familiar these past days. Not the wariness of a stranger. Not even simple gratitude for a wife who could fix wagon wheels and reorganize pantries, but something rounder and more dangerous, something that felt uncomfortably close to what he'd buried under a pine tree east of the cabin and told himself he'd never feel again. "If the letter comes back with nothing," Evelyn said, setting the firewood down harder than necessary. "If my contacts in Cheyenne can't confirm what I think Grayson's up to, then we've got nothing but my word against a railroad company's paperwork. And my word—" She stopped, jaw tightening. "My word hasn't counted for much historically against a man's paperwork." "Your word's good enough for me." "That's kind. It won't be good enough for a judge." Caleb had no answer for that because she wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. A woman's testimony, however sharp, however grounded in years of clerking land records, would mean little in a territorial courtroom stacked against a railroad with money enough to buy whatever expertise it needed. They needed proof. Documented, certified, undeniable proof, and proof was exactly what a letter riding 6 days through mountain passes might or might not deliver. It arrived on the 7th day, carried by the same rider rode, worn and half-frozen, thrusting a thick envelope into Evelyn's hands, like he'd been carrying something dangerous the whole way, and was glad to be rid of it. Evelyn's hands shook, tearing it open. Caleb watched her scan the pages, 3 of them dense with handwriting, a 4th folded separately, official-looking, stamped, and watched her face shift from anxious hope to something harder, colder, the flat calm of someone confirming a fear rather than discovering a surprise. "Well?" Caleb asked, unable to wait any longer. "His name's not Silas Grayson," Evelyn said slowly. "Not really. My friend Martha still clerks at the Cheyenne Land Office. She recognized the description I gave her the moment she read it. Man goes by 3 or 4 names depending on the territory. Real name's Silas Doyle. He's the younger brother of a land registrar named Marcus Doyle, her voice caught just slightly, who I testified against 6 years back in the fraud case I told you about. The one that cost that young rancher couple their 40 acres. Caleb went very still. Testified against. I was the clerk who found the discrepancy in the resurvey. I brought it to the district attorney myself once I understood what had happened. Once I understood Marcus Doyle had been paid to falsify boundary lines for 6 homesteads that stood in the railroad's way. My testimony got him removed from his post. Should have gotten him prosecuted outright, except he had friends in Cheyenne with money enough to make the charges quietly disappear instead. She set the papers down on the table with hands that had gone unsteady. He never went to prison. He just moved his operation. And it seems his brother's been running the same scheme for him ever since, one territory at a time, wherever Marcus Doyle's reputation hasn't caught up to him yet. And now his brother's standing in my yard, talking friendly about right-of-way. Now his brother's standing in your yard, Evelyn confirmed, and something in her voice had gone thin and frightened, in a way Caleb hadn't heard since that first night by the fire. Married to the one woman in the entire territory who could recognize exactly what he's doing before it's too late to stop him. The realization settled over both of them, slow and heavy, the shape of the danger sharpening into something far more personal than a simple land dispute. This wasn't only about boundary lines and railroad money anymore. This was about a man who had every reason in the world to make sure Evelyn Carter never got the chance to testify against his family a second time. "He doesn't know," Caleb said, though it came out more hope than certainty. "He doesn't know who you are. Not yet. You went by Carter on that agency application. That's not the name you clerked under, is it?" "No. Carter's my mother's maiden name. I took it back after she didn't finish, didn't need to, after everything. But Caleb, if he's the kind of man to run a resurvey scheme this brazen, he's the kind of man who checks who he's dealing with. It might already be too late." As if summoned by the very fear in her voice, hoofbeats sounded on the frozen trail below. And this time, there was more than one set. Caleb counted at least 3 riders coming up fast, faster than a friendly return visit had any business moving. "Inside," Caleb said, already reaching for the rifle propped by the door. "Now." "Caleb." "Now, Evelyn, please." Something in his voice, not command exactly, but a plea sharpened by real fear for her, moved her fast, and she was through the door with the papers clutched to her chest before the riders crested the last rise into full view. Silas Grayson led them, that same easy smile fixed in place, but the 2 men flanking him wore expressions that had nothing friendly in them at all. Hands resting loose and ready near coats that hung heavy on one side in a way Caleb recognized from 10 years of reading danger in strangers before they announced themselves. "Whitaker." Grayson reined up short of the porch, smile widening. "Come early, I know. Couldn't help it. Circumstances changed some since our last conversation." "That's so. That's so." Grayson swung down from his saddle with unhurried confidence, the 2 men behind him staying mounted, watching the cabin windows with an attention that made Caleb's grip tighten on the rifle. "See, I did some checking after I left here last week. Man in my line of work, he learns to check on folks he's doing business with, learns their history, learns who they married and why and what that wife of theirs might have been up to before some agency shipped her out west." Caleb's blood went cold. "Say what you're here to say, Grayson." "I'm here to say that Evelyn Carter, or should I say Evelyn Doyle, seeing as that's the name on some old Cheyenne clerking records before she went and changed it, done my family a great disservice some years back. Cost my brother his position, cost him his good name in 3 separate territories, since on account of word traveling the way word does." Grayson's smile had gone thin now, all the friendliness burned away to something colder underneath. "I expect you didn't know that when you sent for a bride. Expect the agency didn't mention it either, seeing as it's the sort of detail that tends to sour a marriage arrangement before it even starts." The cabin door creaked, and Evelyn stepped out onto the porch despite everything, chin lifted, papers no longer visible, hands steady even though Caleb could see the fine tremor running through her from 10 feet away. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Doyle," she said, using his true name, deliberately watching it land like a slap across his composure. "And I know exactly what your brother did to the Hendricks family, and I've got the district attorney's own case file to prove every word of it should this territory's land office ever need reminding." Doyle's jaw tightened, the mask of friendliness cracking fully now. "That case is closed. That case was buried, not closed. There's a considerable difference, and I expect a territorial judge would agree given the right encouragement to look again." "You threatening me, Mrs. Whitaker?" "I'm informing you." Evelyn's voice didn't waver, though her hands hidden in the folds of her skirt had curled into fists tight enough to hurt. "I'm informing you that whatever scheme you're running on this homestead, whatever resurvey you're planning to file claiming a boundary discrepancy that doesn't exist, I will see it exposed exactly the same way I exposed your brother's. I know every trick in that particular book, Mr. Doyle, because I watched your family write it." For a long moment nobody moved. The 2 mounted men behind Doyle, going very still, hands drifting a fraction closer to their coats, and Caleb felt every muscle in his body coil tight, rifle steady, but his mind racing through outcomes that all ended badly if this went one wrong direction. Then Doyle laughed, short, humorless, more warning than amusement. "You've got sand, I'll give you that. Same sand that cost my brother everything he'd built. But you're forgetting something, Mrs. Whitaker. He nodded toward the cabin, toward the homestead spread out behind it, toward everything Caleb had built alone across 10 hard winters. You're not sitting behind a clerk's desk in Cheyenne anymore, with a district attorney's office 2 doors down, and law close enough to matter. You're out here. Alone. Middle of the territory. Nearest marshal, a 2-day ride in good weather, which this ain't. Things happen out here that don't happen where there's witnesses close by. Fires happen. Accidents happen. Man loses his footing on an icy trail, breaks his fool neck, and there's nobody to say different than what the next fella tells the coroner. The threat hung in the cold air, plain as anything, and Caleb felt his finger find the rifle's trigger guard, every instinct screaming at him to end this confrontation with force before it could turn into something worse. "You'd best get off my land," Caleb said, voice low and dangerous, in a way Evelyn had never heard from him before. "Before I decide accidents happen out here to more than one kind of man." Doyle's eyes flicked to the rifle, calculating, and for a moment, Caleb thought the whole thing might tip over into violence right there in his own yard. Then Doyle smiled again, cold and thin, and stepped back toward his horse. "No need for that kind of talk, Whitaker. I'm a businessman, not some outlaw looking for trouble." He swung up into the saddle, looked back down at Evelyn with an expression that made her skin crawl. "You've got until the end of the month to reconsider that offer. After that, the resurvey gets filed regardless, and I expect you'll find the Territorial Land Office a good deal less sympathetic to a woman with your particular history than you're counting on. Folks don't much trust the word of a woman who ran off from her own husband, whatever reasons she claims for it. Especially not against a duly filed survey with a licensed surveyor's signature on it." "My reasons," Evelyn said, voice shaking now with fury rather than fear, "are scarred into my own body. Mr. Doyle and any judge with eyes and a conscience would see them for exactly what they are. Judges see what money shows them to see, Mrs. Whitaker. You of all people ought to remember that lesson." Doyle tipped his hat, mockingly polite, and turned his horse back down the trail, his 2 silent companions falling in behind him, without a word exchanged, leaving Caleb and Evelyn standing on the porch in a silence that rang louder than any words could have. Neither of them spoke until the riders had disappeared entirely from view. Then Evelyn's knees seemed to give out all at once, and she sat down hard on the porch step, hands shaking now that there was no audience left to shake in front of. "Evelyn." Caleb was beside her instantly, rifle set aside, hands hovering uncertain over her shoulders before she leaned into him. Without hesitation, something breaking loose in her chest that had been held rigid through the whole confrontation. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows everything, and he's not wrong about the judge, Caleb. Territorial courts out here, they don't look kindly on women who ran from marriages, whatever the reason. They'll see a scandal before they see the truth. His brother's got money and connections, still even disgraced. I've got nothing but a case file and a scar nobody wants to look at straight on. You've got me, a rancher with 300 acres and a bad ankle." Her laugh came out broken half-sob. "Against a railroad, Caleb. Against men who talk about accidents like they're discussing the weather. Then we don't give them the chance for an accident." Caleb pulled back enough to look at her directly, something fierce and steady settling into his expression that hadn't been there before. 10 years of quiet mountain survival, finally finding a purpose worth fighting for out loud. "We go to town. Today. We talk to the marshal. We talk to the land office. We get ahead of whatever filing he's planning before he can plant it. The land office out here answers to territorial appointees. If Doyle's got money moving through the right hands, then we find hands his money hasn't reached yet." Caleb stood pulling her up with him, some new resolve hardening every line of his face. "You said yourself, you know the tricks. You know what a fraudulent resurvey looks like on paper. So we get our own honest surveyor out here before he can plant a false one, and we get sworn statements filed the same week, and we make certain that whatever lies Doyle's cooking up, there's already truth sitting in the record ahead of it. That takes money we don't have, time we might not have if he's serious about accidents. Then we find the money. I've got savings put back small as it is, And I know men in this territory, trappers, ranchers, men who've dealt with railroad surveyors trying to steal their bottomland same as they're trying to steal ours. Men who'll stand up as witnesses if it comes to that, and men who won't take kindly to hearing a woman's been threatened on her own homestead." Evelyn stared at him, something in her chest twisting at the fierce certainty in his voice, the way he'd said ours without a second thought, the way he was already planning a fight instead of calculating a retreat. "You'd do all that," she said quietly, "for a wife you didn't even want 2 weeks ago." "I'd do all that," Caleb said, "for the woman who pulled me out of a blizzard with her bare hands and told me my scars weren't the ones that mattered." He took her face gently between his palms, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You ain't alone in this fight anymore, Evelyn. Whatever Doyle thinks he knows about accidents and isolated mountains, he's about to learn different." For a moment, neither of them moved, the closeness of it settling into something neither had quite dared before. And then Evelyn closed the last small distance between them and kissed him, soft and uncertain at first, then steadier as he answered in kind, both of them holding on to something that had grown, without either fully noticing until this exact moment of threat and fear, into something far more than a marriage of convenience. They broke apart slowly, breathless, and Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "We'll fight this together," he said, "whatever it costs." "Together," Evelyn agreed, and the words settled between them like a vow stronger than the one they'd spoken in front of a preacher 2 weeks before. The ride into Bitter Creek took the better part of the afternoon. Evelyn beside him on the wagon seat, with the Cheyenne case file clutched tight against her chest, and by the time they reached the marshal's office, the winter sun had already begun sliding toward the western peaks, throwing long blue shadows across the frozen street. Marshal Tom Kessler was a broad, gray-mustached man who'd known Caleb since before Sarah's death, and he listened to their account with a stillness that gave away nothing until Evelyn finished laying out Doyle's threat word for word. "Accidents happen," Kessler repeated, slowly, echoing Doyle's own phrase back with visible distaste. "Man said that plane in front of witnesses, in front of my husband," Evelyn said, "and 2 of his own men, though I doubt they'd testify against their employer. Don't need them to, if you're both willing to swear to it before a judge." Kessler leaned back in his chair, studying the case file Evelyn slid across the desk with the same careful attention Caleb had come to recognize as her particular gift, the ability to make even a hostile stranger see the shape of a truth laid out plain in front of them. "This the same Marcus Doyle scandal from up Cheyenne Way, heard whispers of that years back. Didn't know the details. I have the details, Marshal. Every one of them sworn and notarized." Evelyn's voice had steadied into something crisp and professional, the clerk resurfacing beneath the frightened wife, and Caleb watched with something like awe as she laid out the entire scheme. The pattern of resurveys, the falsified boundary claims, the string of homesteads lost across 3 territories over 6 years with a precision that left no room for doubt. Kessler read in silence for a long while, then set the file down and looked at both of them with an expression that had gone hard and decided. "I'll wire the territorial marshal's office tonight. And I know Judge Alden's riding circuit through here next month. Man's got no patience for railroad money buying land. It hasn't earned honest. If half of what's in this file holds up, and I expect it will, given how thorough you've been, Mrs. Whitaker, we can get an injunction filed against any resurvey Doyle's planning before he ever gets ink on paper." Relief flooded through Caleb so fast it nearly buckled his knees. But Kessler wasn't finished, his expression darkening further. "Problem is, that takes time. Wire response judge's schedule, we're looking at 2, maybe 3 weeks before anything official stands between you and that man. And if he's the kind to talk about accidents so casual, 3 weeks is plenty of time for him to make good on it, especially out at your place, isolated as it sits." "So what do we do?" Caleb asked. "Sit and wait to see if he means it. You don't sit anywhere alone, that's what you do." Kessler stood already reaching for his coat. "I'll ride out with a deputy, keep watch on your place best we can manage till the injunction's official. And you keep that rifle loaded and close, Whitaker, because a man who threatens accidents this plain usually means to arrange one before the law catches up to stop him." The ride home was quiet tension coiled tight in both of them, despite Kessler's promise of protection. and it was full dark by the time the cabin came back into view. Dark in a way that made something cold twist in Caleb's stomach even before he understood why. No lamp burned in the window. He'd banked the fire low before they left, sure, but he'd left a lamp lit deliberate, same as always, and the black windows staring back at them from the trail felt suddenly terribly wrong. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "get down. Stay behind the wagon." "Caleb, please." The word came out rough, urgent, and something in his tone moved her fast, dropping down into the wagon's shadow, while Caleb reached for the rifle he hadn't let out of arm's reach since Doyle's visit. He approached the cabin's slow senses, straining against the dark, and the smell hit him 20 feet out. Coal oil, sharp and unmistakable, soaked into the porch boards in a pattern too deliberate to be accident. "Someone's been here," he called back, voice tight. "Stay put." He circled, wide rifle ready, and found the back window forced open. Glass broken inward, snow tracked through onto the cabin floor in boot prints, too large to be his own or Evelyn's. Inside the cabin had been torn through fast and rough. The sewing basket dumped its contents, scattered the shelf of preserves Evelyn had so carefully organized, swept clean onto the floor in a mess of broken glass and spilled brine. And on the table, weighted down by a knife driven clean through the wood, sat a single sheet of paper. Caleb pulled it free with shaking hands, and even in the dim moonlight through the broken window, the message was plain enough to read. "Reconsider the offer, or the next fire won't be an accident that misses." Caleb stood frozen with the note in his hand for the length of 3 full heartbeats, before his body caught up to what his mind had already understood, and then he was moving fast back out into the dark, toward the wagon where Evelyn crouched low in the shadow of the wheel. "Someone was here," he said, voice tight and controlled in the particular way of a man forcing calm over something closer to rage. "Broke the back window, tore through the cabin, left a message." What kind of message? He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything before he even handed her the paper, her hands trembling as she read the words by the thin light of the rising moon. "He means it," she whispered. "Caleb, he means every word of it. I know. We can't stay here tonight. If he's willing to threaten fire, we ain't staying here tonight." Caleb was already unhitching one of the horse's movements, fast and economical, 10 years of mountain instinct taking over where fear might have paralyzed a less practical man. "We're riding back to town. Kessler said he'd watch the place, but I ain't leaving you here to be watched over from a distance while some hired gun of Doyle's decides tonight's the night he makes good on that threat. And the homestead, everything you've built, is still standing whether I'm here to watch it burn or not. Rather it burns with nobody in it than the alternative." He swung up onto the horse, reached down for her, and pulled her up behind him with a grip that spoke more of fear than strength. "Hold on." They rode through the dark at a pace that would have been reckless in daylight, let alone under a moon barely bright enough to pick out the trail's worst ruts. But Caleb navigated it by feel and memory, 10 years of knowing this mountain in his bones, carrying them both safe through switchbacks that could have broken a leg, or worse. Evelyn held tight around his waist, face pressed against his back, feeling his heart hammering even through 2 layers of coat, and understood with sudden clarity that his fear wasn't for the homestead at all. It was for her. They reached Bitter Creek a little past midnight, and Marshal Kessler met them at his own door in his nightshirt rifle, already in hand, before he'd fully processed who was pounding on his porch. "Whitaker, what in blazes?" "Someone broke into the cabin while we were riding back from your office," Caleb said, breathless, helping Evelyn down with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since he'd found that note. "Tore the place apart. Left this." Kessler read the note by lamplight, and his expression, already grim, hardened into something Caleb had only seen from him once before, years back the night a horse thief had shot a rancher's boy over a stolen mare. "That's a written threat of arson," Kessler said, voice flat and dangerous. "That's not land dispute business anymore. That's attempted murder, plain as day, whether he lit anything tonight or not." "Can you arrest him on it?" "I can arrest him on suspicion, sure enough drag him in for questioning. but arresting a man ain't the same as proving a case that'll hold, and Doyle's smart enough to have made certain no witness saw him near your place tonight. He'll deny writing it, deny sending anybody. And without a signature or a confession, it's your word on a note. Against his word, he never touched it. Kessler set the paper down with visible frustration. That said, I ain't waiting around for more proof while a man's out there talking about fire. I'll ride to his hotel myself tonight, rattle him some. Let him know the law's watching close enough that any accident befalling your place gets investigated hard and thorough, starting with him as chief suspect. Mull. That'll spook him into being more careful, not stop him. No, Kessler admitted. Probably won't, but it buys you time and times what we need most right now, waiting on that wire to the territorial marshal and Judge Alden's circuit schedule. Evelyn had been quiet through the exchange, mind working fast behind eyes that had gone sharp and calculating in the way Caleb now recognized as her thinking hardest. And when she finally spoke, both men turned to her with the particular attention she'd earned over the past weeks. There's a faster way, she said. Faster than waiting on Judge Alden's circuit, faster than an injunction crawling through territorial channels. I'm listening, Kessler said. The Northern Pacific's got a regional office in Helena. If I can get documentation of Doyle's pattern, the Hendricks case, the note sworn statements from both of you directly into the hands of the railroad's own legal department above, whatever local authority Doyle thinks he's operating under, they'll want to distance themselves fast. Railroads don't like scandal touching their name, and a resurvey scheme built on threats and fraud is exactly the kind of scandal that gets a man like Doyle fired outright, whatever family connections he's got, faster than any territorial court could manage. Companies protect their reputation quicker than the law protects individual homesteaders, in my experience. You think Doyle's actually working for the railroad official? I think he's using the railroad's name and the railroad's genuine interest in a right-of-way to run his own extortion scheme underneath it, same as his brother did in Cheyenne. Which means the railroad itself might have no idea what he's really doing in their name and might be furious to find out, especially once they understand it's exposing them to exactly the kind of legal liability that scares investors. Kessler considered this, stroking his mustache slow. How do you propose getting documentation to Helena faster than my wire's already moving? I ride there myself, Evelyn said, and Caleb's head snapped toward her fast. No. Caleb. No. Absolutely not. You ride to Helena alone. That's 4 days each way through territory. Doyle's got eyes in, and after tonight, you think I'm letting you out of my sight for a single hour, let alone 8 days. Then you ride with me, and leave the homestead sitting empty for Doyle to burn to the ground while we're gone. The impasse hung between them both, stubborn, both right in their own way, until Kessler cleared his throat with the particular weariness of a man who'd mediated more than his share of married arguments over the years. There's a stage line runs to Helena twice a week, he said. Faster than horseback, safer too, seeing as it travels main roads with other passengers and a driver who knows the route. Next one leaves in 2 days' time. Gives you time to prepare the documentation proper, and gives me time to organize protection for the homestead while you're gone. I've got a deputy I trust, and I expect I can rally a few of your neighbors too, men who won't take kindly to hearing about threats made against a woman on her own land. 2 days, Evelyn said slowly, looking at Caleb now instead of the marshal. 2 days to prepare everything, then I go to Helena while you stay to protect the homestead and coordinate with the marshal here. Caleb's jaw worked every protective instinct in him, rebelling against the plan, even as his mind slower to catch up than hers, but every bit as sharp once it did recognize the sense in it. I don't like it, he said finally. I don't much like any part of the last 2 days, if we're being honest about our likes and dislikes. Despite everything, a short, surprised laugh cracked out of him, and something in the tension between them eased just slightly. Fair point. I'll be careful. I'll travel by stage in company, and I'll be back before you know it, with enough documentation to bury Silas Doyle so deep he won't see daylight again till his hair's gone gray in a territorial prison. That a promise? "That's a promise," Evelyn said, and meant it with a fierceness that left no room for doubt. The 2 days that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Evelyn drafting sworn statements with a precision that impressed even Kessler. Caleb reinforcing the cabin's damaged window and arranging for two of his nearest neighbors, gruff ranching men named Amos Reed and Frank Callahan, to keep watch on rotating shifts while he and Evelyn were both occupied with the fight ahead. Word spread fast through Bitter Creek's tight community, the way word always did in small mountain towns, and by the second evening, Caleb found himself humbled by the number of neighbors who showed up unannounced, offering help, extra rifles, extra hands, extra pairs of eyes, watching the trail for strangers who didn't belong. "Didn't expect this," Caleb admitted to Amos Reed, watching the older rancher check the loads on his own rifle with the ease of long practice. "Didn't figure anybody in this town thought much of me one way or another. Didn't think much of you being fool enough to winter alone up that mountain for 10 years. That's true enough," Amos said, not unkindly. "But your wife stood up to Silas Doyle right there on Main Street, plain as anything, in front of half the town. Told him to his face she'd expose his family's fraud same as she done once before. Takes more sand than most folks got doing that. Word travels fast about a thing like that. Folks respect sand out here, whatever else they might have whispered about a bride who didn't look the way some expected." Something warm moved through Caleb's chest at that pride mixed with something else entirely, a fierce protective love that had crept up on him so gradual he'd hardly noticed it arriving until it was already fully formed, undeniable, impossible to mistake for anything less. The stage left at dawn on the third day, and Caleb stood at the depot watching Evelyn climb aboard, with a leather satchel of documentation clutched tight against her every instinct in him, screaming to climb up beside her, regardless of the homestead, regardless of practicality. "4 days there," she said through the open window, voice steady despite the fear he could see flickering behind her eyes. "A day or two to present everything to the railroad's legal counsel 4 days back. 10 days at most, Caleb. You can survive 10 days without me." "Didn't say I could." "Caleb." "I'll survive it," he said, though the words cost him more than he expected. "Don't mean I'll like a single hour of it." She reached through the window, and he took her hand, holding on until the driver called out, and the stage lurched forward, breaking their grip apart, inch by reluctant inch, until distance made it impossible to hold on any longer. "Come back to me," Caleb called after the departing coach, and thought he saw her nod through the window, though the dust kicked up by the wheels made it hard to be certain. The days that followed crawled by with an agony Caleb hadn't anticipated. 10 years of solitary mountain life, having apparently done nothing to prepare him for the particular torment of waiting on someone he'd come to need as much as he'd come to need Evelyn Carter. He kept busy, reinforced the cabin, worked alongside Amos and Frank on watch rotations, rode into town twice to check with Kessler on any word from the territorial marshal's office, but every quiet moment brought his mind circling back to the same fear that Doyle denied his easy target at the homestead might redirect his attention toward the road to Helena instead. That fear proved not entirely unfounded. On the 6th day, a rider came up the mountain trail at a hard gallop, and Caleb's hand was on his rifle before he recognized Frank Callahan's horse, the rancher's face grim with news he clearly didn't relish delivering. "Trouble in town," Frank said, barely reining up before speaking. "Doyle's back. Come in on the noon stage himself, and he ain't alone this time, brought 4 men with him instead of 2, and word is they ain't surveyors. Word from the stable hand who saw them unload is they're carrying more guns than tools." Caleb's stomach dropped straight through the floor. He know about Evelyn's trip to Helena. Kessler thinks he must. Reckon that's exactly why he's come back with more men this time. Figures with the wife gone, and you shorthanded, this is his best chance to finish what that note started. When? Kessler don't know. But he sent me to fetch you into town. Figures you're safer there with more guns around than sitting alone out here waiting for whatever Doyle's planning. Caleb's mind raced through the calculus fast: abandon the homestead and lose whatever ground they'd need to defend later, or stay and risk facing Doyle's men alone with only Amos for backup. Neither option sat right, but the thought of Evelyn returning from Helena to find him dead or the homestead burned settled the decision fast. "Get Amos," he said. "We ride into town together, all three of us. Ain't leaving this place completely empty. But I ain't facing 5 armed men alone up here either, not with the odds stacked that lopsided." They rode hard for Bitter Creek, reaching the edge of town just as the winter sun began sliding low toward the peaks, and found Kessler waiting outside his office with an expression that told Caleb the situation had already shifted since Frank's departure. "Doyle's holed up at the hotel," Kessler said without preamble. "But that ain't the worst of it. Got word not 20 minutes back telegraph office intercepted a wire Doyle sent out this morning before we even knew he was back in town. Wired someone in Helena. Someone at the Northern Pacific Regional Office." Caleb's blood ran cold. "Saying what?" "Telegraph operator's a friend of mine showed me the copy before Doyle's man could collect it. Wire warned somebody named Pemberton Regional Counsel for the railroad. Apparently that a disgruntled former employee was traveling to Helena with, quote, false and malicious accusations meant to extort the company. Told this Pemberton fellow to have the woman turned away and detained if necessary, pending investigation of her own criminal history." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He's trying to get to Evelyn before she can present the documentation, trying to discredit her before she even opens her mouth. That's my read on it too. "Can we wire ahead? Warn the railroad office directly, get our own account there before Doyle's lies land first." "Already tried," Kessler said grimly. "Wire lines between here and Helena went down sometime yesterday. Storm damage further up the pass, according to the operator. No way to send word ahead till the line's repaired, and no telling how long that'll take in this weather." Caleb felt something close to panic clawing up his throat. The helplessness of it, worse than any physical danger he'd have known how to fight directly. Evelyn was riding straight into a trap neither of them had anticipated arriving in Helena, with nothing but her own word, against a wire full of lies that would reach the railroad's ears first, painting her as exactly the kind of disgruntled criminal woman Doyle needed the world to believe her to be. "I have to go to her," Caleb said. "Now, tonight. Caleb, the stage don't run again till... Then I ride, hard as the horse'll carry me, switching mounts wherever I can buy or borrow fresh ones along the way. I ain't letting her walk into that alone, not after everything she's already survived, not while some coward's lies get there first and paint her as the criminal instead of him." Kessler studied him a long moment, then nodded, slow understanding written plain across his weathered face. 4 days by stage. Man riding hard switching horses might make it in 3, maybe less if the weather holds and he don't break his own fool neck trying. "Then I'd best get started." "Caleb!" Kessler's hand landed heavy on his shoulder before he could turn away. "You go riding off half-cocked into a blizzard trying to catch a stage, you're liable to end up frozen in a ditch, same as you nearly did 2 weeks back. Evelyn didn't drag you out of that storm just to watch you ride into another one alone." The truth of it landed hard, and Caleb forced himself to breathe, to think past the fear clawing at his chest, to remember the woman who'd taught him in the space of a few short weeks that surviving wasn't the same as living, that some risks were worth taking with a clear head instead of blind panic. "Then help me think it through," Caleb said. "Because I ain't sitting here doing nothing while that man's lies reach her before I can." Kessler nodded, already turning toward his office. "Come inside. Let's see what we can arrange that don't get you killed proving your devotion." What they arranged over the following hour was this. Caleb would ride at first light, weather permitting, with a letter from Kessler himself. Territorial Marshal's seal, attached, addressed directly to the Northern Pacific's Regional Legal Counsel, confirming the threats made against Evelyn's life, confirming the arson note as evidence already in the Marshal's possession, confirming Silas Doyle's true identity, and his brother's prior fraud conviction, avoided only through bought influence. It wouldn't reach Helena before Caleb himself riding hard, but it would arrive close enough behind him to reinforce whatever he managed to say once he got there. He rode out before dawn, and the 3 days that followed blurred into a single continuous ache of cold and exhaustion and grim determination. Switching horses at every way station along the route, sleeping only when his body threatened outright collapse, driven by a fear that had nothing to do with land or money, and everything to do with a woman who'd walked into his life 2.5 weeks ago and rearranged everything he thought he understood about what he needed to survive. He reached Helena on the evening of the third day, half-frozen saddle sore beyond anything he'd experienced even in 10 years of mountain winters, and went straight to the Northern Pacific's regional office, despite the late hour pounding on the door, until a night clerk finally answered, alarmed by the desperate, wild-eyed state of the man demanding entry. "I need to see whoever's handling a case involving a woman named Evelyn Whitaker," Caleb said, breathless, barely able to stand straight after 3 days in the saddle. "Please, it's urgent. Her life may depend on it." The clerk, to his credit, didn't turn him away, and within 20 minutes, Caleb found himself standing in the office of a tired-looking but sharp-eyed man named Harold Pemberton, regional legal counsel for the Northern Pacific, who studied Caleb's road-worn, desperate state with an expression caught between suspicion and genuine concern. "Mr. Whitaker," Pemberton said slowly, "I received a wire some days back regarding a woman matching that description. Warned me she might arrive with fraudulent accusations against one of our surveying contractors." "That wire was a lie," Caleb said, and pulled Kessler's letter from inside his coat, with hands still numb from cold. "This here's from the territorial marshal in Bitter Creek. Confirms everything my wife's about to tell you if she hasn't already. And confirms the man who sent that wire, Silas Doyle. Though he's used other names, threatened to burn our homestead to the ground with us in it, if we didn't sell our land at a fraction of its worth." Pemberton read the letter in silence expression, shifting from polite skepticism to something considerably grimmer as he absorbed the marshal's official account. "Your wife," Pemberton said slowly when he finished reading, "arrived in Helena 2 days ago. Mr. Whitaker presented documentation remarkably similar to what's described in this letter. I'll be honest with you, given the wire I'd received beforehand, I was inclined to treat her claims with considerable skepticism. Nearly turned her away outright." Caleb's heart seized. "Where is she now?" "She's perfectly safe, if that's your concern," Pemberton said, and something in his tone finally softened. Understanding dawning as he watched the desperate relief flood across Caleb's exhausted face. "Your wife, Mr. Whitaker, is a remarkably persuasive woman. When I expressed doubt about her claims, she didn't argue or plead. She simply laid out document by document a pattern of fraud spanning 3 territories in 6 years, cross-referenced against our own company's surveying contracts in each location. Took her the better part of an afternoon, but by the end of it, I'd wired our head office in St. Paul myself, recommending Silas Doyle's contract be terminated immediately, and the matter referred to federal authorities given the interstate nature of the fraud." Relief crashed through Caleb so total it nearly buckled his knees. "She's safe. She's staying at the Broadwater Hotel 2 blocks from here, and has been for the past 2 days working with our internal investigators to compile a complete case file." Pemberton stood, extending a hand. Caleb shook with fingers that had gone numb somewhere around the 2nd day of riding. "I'll say this plain, Mr. Whitaker. Your wife saved this company considerable embarrassment and legal liability by bringing this to us directly, rather than pursuing it solely through territorial courts. Whatever debt this company owes her for that service, we intend to honor it. Full restoration of your land, patent formal apology on record, and I expect federal charges against both Doyle brothers before this is finished." Caleb could barely process the words, exhaustion and relief tangling together into something that left him lightheaded. But none of it mattered. Next to the single fact burning brightest in his mind, Evelyn was safe 2 blocks away, and after 3 days of desperate riding through winter passes, he intended to reach her before another minute passed. He found her in the hotel's small lobby, hunched over a table covered in documents, hair falling loose from its pins, looking more exhausted than he'd ever seen her, and more radiant, too, in the particular way of someone who'd fought a hard battle and was winning it on her own terms. Caleb, his name in her voice disbelieving and overjoyed all at once, was the last thing he heard clearly before she was across the room and in his arms, and he held on to her like a man who'd nearly lost something he couldn't have named 2.5 weeks ago, and now understood he couldn't survive losing it all. "You rode here?" she said against his chest, voice muffled and thick with tears. 3 days, Caleb. You rode 3 days through mountain passes in winter. I can see it on you. You look half dead. Wasn't going to let you face this alone, not after what Doyle tried. You knew about the wire. Found out same day you'd have arrived here. Rode straight through, barely stopped because I couldn't stand the thought of his lies reaching you before I could. He pulled back enough to look at her properly. Exhaustion forgotten in the flood of everything he felt, seeing her whole and safe in front of him. Pemberton says you did it anyway. Convinced them without me, without the marshal's letter, just you and a stack of papers and more sand than any 5 men I know combined. I had good teachers. She said something fierce and proud, flickering behind her tired eyes. 6 years married to a man who taught me exactly what cruelty looks like. 4 years clerking land records that taught me exactly how fraud gets built and how it falls apart under the right pressure. Everything that hurt me, Caleb, I turned it into the thing that saved us. He kissed her then, right there in the hotel lobby, with Pemberton's clerks watching, curious from the front desk, kissed her with 3 days of fear and desperate hope behind it, and felt her answer with equal fierceness. Both of them finally allowing themselves the relief of having survived something neither had fully expected to survive intact. It's not over yet, Evelyn said when they finally broke apart, practical mind already working even through the exhaustion. Pemberton's recommendation goes to St. Paul, but Doyle's still in Bitter Creek. Still armed. Still dangerous, whatever the railroad decides. Then we get back there as fast as we can and make sure Kessler's ready to arrest him the moment federal word comes through. Together this time, Evelyn said, gripping his hand tight. No more splitting up, no more riding off alone in either direction. Together. Caleb agreed, and meant it with everything. 3 days of desperate riding, and 2.5 weeks of falling for a woman he'd once judged too fragile for this mountain had taught him about what that word truly meant. They left Helena 2 days later. Documentation secured Pemberton's formal letter of support, tucked alongside Kessler's original in Evelyn's satchel, and rode back toward Bitter Creek together. This time sharing a single horse for the stretches where fresh mounts weren't available. Sharing warmth and quiet conversation, and an ease between them that felt entirely different from the wary silence of that first wagon ride weeks before. What happens to us? Evelyn asked, somewhere on the second day of the return journey. Once this is settled, once Doyle's arrested, once the land's secure. We keep living, Caleb said simply. Keep building. Keep being exactly what we've become these past weeks, except without a criminal threatening to burn it all down around us. That's simple. Nothing about it's been simple, Evelyn, not one single day since you stepped off that train. But what we've built, in spite of that part feels about as simple and certain as anything I've known in 10 years. He looked at her, something soft and certain in his expression, that had nothing to do with fear or gratitude anymore, only plain and steady love. I didn't marry you for help surviving winter. Turns out I married you because somewhere in these past weeks, without either of us quite noticing it happen, you became the reason winter's worth surviving at all. Evelyn's eyes filled, and this time she didn't look away or hide the tears, just let them fall as she leaned into him. The horse's steady rhythm carrying them both closer to home, closer to whatever confrontation still waited in Bitter Creek, but carrying them there together finally and completely, in a way neither of them intended to let go of again. They reached the outskirts of Bitter Creek as the winter sun began its slow descent behind the peaks, and even from a distance, Caleb could see something was wrong. Too many horses gathered outside the marshal's office. Too much tension visible in the small knots of townsfolk standing along the frozen street. All of it pointing toward a confrontation that had apparently been building in their absence and was now reaching some kind of breaking point. They'd arrived just in time, or perhaps just too late to be part of. Caleb spurred the horse forward before conscious thought caught up with instinct, Evelyn's arms tightening around his waist as they closed the last stretch of frozen road into town, and what came into focus at the edge of the gathered crowd stopped his heart cold. Silas Doyle stood in the middle of Main Street, 4 armed men fanned out behind him and facing him down. A lone rifle-raised stance planted wide and unmoving stood Marshal Tom Kessler, with Amos Reed and Frank Callahan positioned at angles behind him, rifles of their own, steady despite the odds stacked plain against them. Whitaker. Doyle's voice carried clear across the frozen street the moment he spotted them. Something ugly, twisting his mouth into a smile that held no warmth at all. Perfect timing. Was just explaining to your marshal here that a man's got a right to defend himself against false accusations, and that sometimes defending himself requires taking matters into his own hands. Get down, Caleb murmured to Evelyn, already sliding off the horse himself, positioning his body between her and the 5 armed men without conscious decision, pure instinct driving every movement. Stay behind the wagon. Caleb, no, I'm not hiding while, please. The word came out raw, desperate, in a way that stopped her argument cold. I can't lose you. Not now, not after everything. I need you safe while I figure out what's happening here. Something in his eyes convinced her where words might not have, and Evelyn slid down reluctantly, staying low behind the wagon's frame, while Caleb walked forward into the tense standoff, every step deliberate, every muscle coiled tight, with a fear that had nothing to do with his own safety. What's this about Doyle? Caleb called out, forcing steadiness into his voice. This is about your wife filing false reports with a railroad company that employed me in good faith, Doyle said, though the practiced friendliness from their first meeting had burned away entirely, now replaced by something cornered and dangerous. Federal marshals supposedly riding out from the territorial capital word is on account of accusations your wife carried all the way to Helena. Seems to me a man facing federal charges built on lies has got precious little left to lose by settling accounts here and now before that marshal arrives to complicate things further. Those weren't lies and you know it. Kessler's voice was iron-hard rifle steady, despite being outnumbered 4 men to 3. Wire came through this morning, Doyle. Northern Pacific's terminated your contract effective immediate and federal fraud charges are being filed against you and your brother both. This ends here one way or another, whether you like the ending or not. Doyle's composure cracked visibly at that something wild entering his expression, and Caleb felt the situation tip dangerously close to violence with every passing second. 5 armed men and a cornered criminal facing off against 3 defenders in the middle of a public street. Then I've got nothing left to lose, Doyle said, voice climbing toward something unhinged, which means burning that homestead to the ground costs me nothing more than what I'm already facing. Might as well make it hurt on my way down. His hand moved toward his coat, and everything happened at once. Kessler's rifle coming up fast. Amos and Frank bracing for a fight that seemed suddenly terribly inevitable, and Caleb throwing himself sideways without thought, putting his own body between Doyle's reaching hand and the wagon where Evelyn crouched. Because whatever else happened in the next few seconds, he would not let harm reach her. Doyle, don't? The voice that cut through the tension wasn't Kessler's or Caleb's. It belonged to one of Doyle's own men, the youngest of the 4, stepping back fast, with his hands raised away from his own weapon. This ain't what we signed on for. Federal charges is one thing, but gunning down a marshal and half a town in broad daylight, that's a hanging offense, sure as anything, and I ain't swinging for your family troubles. The words landed like a splash of cold water across the standoff, and Caleb watched the other 3 men exchange glances that spoke louder than words. Hired muscle, not true believers, weighing their own necks against loyalty to a man whose scheme had just collapsed spectacularly in front of an entire town. He's right, Doyle? A second man said, backing away slowly, hands raised in the same placating gesture. Ain't dying today for your brother's mess. Ain't dying for land that ain't even mine. One by one, the hired men stepped back, weapons lowering, until Doyle stood alone in the street, the fury and desperation on his face curdling into something closer to panic as he realized his advantage had evaporated in the space of a few sentences. Cowards, he spat. The lot of you cowards, smart men. Kessler corrected, rifle never wavering. Which is more than I can say for you right now, Doyle. Drop the gun. Hands where I can see them. This ends peaceful, or it ends with you shot in the middle of Main Street in front of 40 witnesses. And either way, it ends the same. You ain't walking away from this free. The seconds stretched impossibly long. Doyle's hand still hovering near his coat calculation, and desperation warring visible across his face, and Caleb held his breath, positioned still between the confrontation and the wagon, praying with everything in him that this ended without bloodshed. Then slowly, Doyle's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him all at once, replaced by something hollow and defeated. "This ain't over," he said, but the threat had lost all its teeth, nothing behind it now but empty bitterness. "You think this territory's big enough that my family's reach don't extend? Your family's reach," Evelyn said, stepping out from behind the wagon, despite everything, despite Caleb's earlier plea, unable to stay hidden any longer now that the immediate danger had passed. "Just got exposed clean across 3 territories, Mr. Doyle. Your brother's already disgraced. Federal marshals are riding to arrest you both. Whatever reach you imagine your family still has, I expect it's about to shrink considerably once this trial concludes." Doyle's eyes found her hatred and defeat mixed in equal measure, and for a moment Caleb tensed, ready to move between them again. But Kessler's men were already closing in, disarming Doyle with practiced efficiency, the fight entirely gone out of him, now that his hired guns had abandoned the field, and his scheme lay exposed in front of the whole town. "You," Doyle said, voice venomous even in defeat. "You ruined my brother once already. Wasn't satisfied leaving well enough alone, had to chase this all the way to Helena. I didn't ruin anything that wasn't already rotten," Evelyn said, standing tall and unflinching under his glare in a way that would have been impossible for her 3 weeks ago, back on that train platform, terrified and small and certain of her own worthlessness. "You built a scheme on threats and fraud, Mr. Doyle. I simply made certain the truth caught up to it before more innocent families lost everything the way the Hendricks did. That's not ruin. That's justice 6 years overdue." Kessler's men led Doyle away in irons, his protests trailing off into the cold afternoon air, and the crowd that had gathered slowly began to disperse, murmurs of relief and admiration, following Evelyn as she stood there in the street, still shaking slightly from adrenaline, but standing straighter than Caleb had ever seen her stand. "You're supposed to be safe behind the wagon," he said, pulling her into his arms the moment the immediate danger had fully passed, relief crashing through him, so total his knees nearly buckled with it. "I couldn't hide while you stood there facing 5 armed men alone. Woman's going to be the death of me," Caleb said, though there was nothing but love in the words, his voice muffled against her hair as he held her tight enough to feel her heartbeat racing against his own chest. "Or the making of me. Ain't rightly sure which yet, but I suspect it's both all tangled together." "Both," Evelyn agreed, laughing shakily against his shoulder, tears of relief finally spilling free now that the danger had passed. "I suspect it's very much both, Mr. Whitaker." Kessler approached once the street had cleared, expression grave but satisfied. "Federal marshal should arrive within the week to take formal custody. In the meantime, I'll hold Doyle here, and I expect the charges against him and his brother both will stick. This time company's own legal counsel backing the case makes it a good deal harder for bought influence to make it disappear the way it did in Cheyenne." "And the land?" Caleb asked. "The resurvey threat. Dead and buried far as I'm concerned, given everything that's come out today. Your patent stands exactly where it's always stood. Nobody's got grounds to dispute a boundary that was never in question to begin with. Not once the man claiming otherwise stands exposed as a fraud and extortionist in front of the whole territory." Relief washed through Caleb so complete it left him lightheaded, and beside him Evelyn exhaled a long breath that seemed to release weeks of accumulated fear all at once. "It's over," she said quietly, disbelief coloring her voice. "Caleb, it's actually over." "It's over," he confirmed, pulling her close again, unable to stop touching her now that the crisis had finally passed, needing the physical reassurance that she was real and safe and staying. "Doyle's finished, the land secure. And you." He pulled back just enough to look at her properly, something fierce and proud swelling in his chest. "You did this. You walked into that railroad office alone, facing down lies sent ahead to discredit you. And you won anyway, with nothing but truth and paperwork and more courage than I've seen from any man I've known." "We did this," Evelyn corrected softly. "Together, same as we've done everything since that first night. You rode 3 days through winter passes to reach me. You stood between me and 5 armed men without a second thought. This was never something either of us did alone, Caleb. Not really. The ride back to the homestead that evening felt different than any journey they'd taken together before lighter. Somehow the weight of Doyle's threat finally lifted, replaced by an ease and certainty that settled comfortable between them as the familiar mountains rose up dark against the evening sky. "Home," Caleb said softly, as the cabin came into view, still standing solid and whole against the tree line, untouched by the fire that had once threatened it. "Home, and nobody left to threaten burning it down around us." "Home," Evelyn echoed, and the word carried a weight and meaning it hadn't held for her in longer than she cared to remember. Not a place she merely occupied, not a temporary shelter she might be forced from at any moment, but somewhere she belonged fully and completely for the first time in 6 long, difficult years. That night, with the fire banked warm and the cabin finally quiet, after weeks of chaos and fear, Caleb found Evelyn standing at the window staring out at the moonlit snow with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Something troubling you?" he asked, coming up beside her, careful the way he'd learned to be careful with her thoughts, giving space for whatever she needed to say without rushing her toward it. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she admitted quietly. 6 years I spent believing that whenever something good happened, it was only the calm before something worse. Doyle's arrested, the land safe. You're standing here beside me instead of walking away in disgust at everything you've learned about my past. Some part of me keeps waiting for the ground to fall away again. Caleb turned her gently to face him, taking both her hands in his. "I understand that fear better than most, I expect. Spent 10 years telling myself not to want anything too much, because everything I'd wanted before got buried under a pine tree east of this cabin. Wanting you, needing you, the way I've come to need you these past weeks that scared me plenty too at first. And now I reckon some things are worth the risk of wanting them anyway. Worth the fear that comes with caring about something enough that losing it would break you clean in half." He brought her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, weathered and strong from weeks of work that had transformed this homestead, from a bachelor's rough shelter into something that finally felt like a proper home. "I ain't going anywhere, Evelyn. Not because of your past, not because of your scars, not because of anything the world's tried to convince you makes you less than whole. I'm staying because you're the finest thing that's ever happened to this mountain, and I intend to spend whatever years I've got left proving that to you every single day until you finally believe it clean through." Tears filled her eyes again, but these carried none of the fear or grief of the tears she'd shed before, only a soft, overwhelming relief. The particular release of a woman who'd spent 6 years believing herself unlovable, finally allowing herself to accept that she'd been wrong all along. "I love you," she whispered, the words coming easier than she'd expected, easier than anything had come in longer than she could remember. "I didn't expect to. Didn't think I had it left in me to love anyone after everything. But I love you, Caleb Whitaker, plain and simple and completely." "I love you too," Caleb said, voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. "Have for a while now, if I'm honest. Think I started falling somewhere around a wagon wheel stuck in the snow, though I was too stubborn to admit it till a blizzard damn near killed me, and you dragged me home anyway." They kissed, then slow and certain. No more secrets standing between them. No more fear of what the other might discover and reject, only the steady growing certainty of two people who had survived separate storms and found against every expectation either had carried onto that train platform weeks before exactly what they hadn't known they were searching for. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither had known before. Evelyn no longer flinching at raised voices or sudden movements, slowly unlearning years of careful vigilance, as Caleb proved day after patient day that gentleness could be constant rather than conditional. Caleb in turn found himself opening in ways 10 years of solitary grief had convinced him he'd forgotten how to do, sharing memories of Sarah, not as wounds to guard jealously, but as parts of himself Evelyn received with grace and understanding rather than jealousy. "She'd have liked you," he told Evelyn one evening, the two of them walking together to the pine tree east of the cabin, where Sarah and the baby, who never drew breath, lay buried beneath a simple wooden marker. "Sarah, I mean. She had your kind of sand. Wouldn't back down from a fight worth having, same as you didn't back down from Doyle." Evelyn knelt by the grave, laying a small bundle of dried wildflowers she'd gathered and pressed weeks before, saved for exactly this moment. Thank you for sharing her with me, for trusting me with this part of your story instead of keeping it locked away. Figured you, of all people, would understand what it means to carry grief and still find room enough left over for something new to grow. Caleb knelt beside her, taking her hand. You taught me that without ever meaning to. That surviving something terrible don't mean you're broken beyond repair. Just means you're carrying more than most and finding a way to keep walking anyway. Spring came slow to the mountain that year, snow retreating in reluctant stages. But when it finally arrived in full, it brought with it a transformation in the homestead that the whole of Bitter Creek soon took notice of. The cabin, once a bachelor's rough shelter, now boasted flower beds Evelyn had planted along the south-facing wall curtains she'd sewn from fabric, traded for at the general store, a porch swing Caleb had built with his own hands during the long winter evenings, determined to give her small comforts she'd never known she was allowed to want. Word of their story had spread through the territory in the months following Doyle's arrest and subsequent trial. How Evelyn Carter Whitaker had exposed a fraud scheme that had cost families across 3 territories their land and livelihoods. How her testimony, backed by Caleb's desperate ride and the railroad's own damning internal investigation, had finally brought both Doyle brothers to federal justice after 6 years of evading consequence. The trial itself, held in early spring. Once travel conditions allowed, drew attention from across the territory, and Evelyn found herself for the first time since fleeing her first marriage, standing in a courtroom not as a victim seeking escape, but as a woman commanding respect for her competence and courage. The prosecution calls Evelyn Whitaker, the district attorney announced, and Caleb watched from the gallery as his wife rose, spine straight, chin lifted with the same defiant confidence he'd first glimpsed on that train platform months before. Except now, the defiance had transformed entirely into something steadier, something that no longer needed to brace against expected judgment. She testified for the better part of 2 hours, laying out the pattern of fraud with the same meticulous precision she'd shown Pemberton in Helena, cross-referencing dates and documents and boundary surveys, until even the defense attorney, clearly hired at considerable expense by whatever remained of the Doyle family fortune, could find no meaningful thread to unravel in her testimony. Objection, Your Honor. The defense attorney tried late in the proceedings, grasping at anything. The witness's credibility is questionable given her history of... He paused clearly, choosing his next words with distaste. Marital instability. Judge Alden, a stern man with little patience for theatrics, fixed the attorney with a look that silenced him instantly. The witness's marriage history has no bearing on her documented expertise in land records or the factual evidence she's presented today. Objection overruled. Continue, counselor, or sit down. Evelyn's testimony combined with Kessler's official account, Pemberton's railroad documentation, and testimony from the Hendricks family themselves, who had traveled from Cheyenne specifically to see justice finally served for the land they'd lost 6 years before, proved overwhelming. Both Doyle brothers were convicted on multiple counts of fraud and extortion. Silas receiving additional charges for the attempted arson threat against the Whitaker homestead, and the judge's sentencing left little room for the kind of bought leniency that had saved Marcus Doyle once before. 15 years, Kessler told them afterward outside the courthouse, satisfaction evident in every line of his weathered face. Both of them. Federal prison, not territorial, so there's no local influence to buy their way free early this time. And the Hendricks family's already filed suit for restitution, backed by the same evidence you two helped compile. Reckon justice finally caught up proper, 6 years overdue, but arrived all the same. Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps in the pale spring sunshine, Caleb's arm around her shoulders, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't fully expected. Not just relief, not just vindication, but a kind of closure she'd never dared believe possible after everything the past 6 years had taken from her. It's really finished, she said softly. All of it. Not just Doyle, but everything before him too. The fear I've carried since Cheyenne, since before that even. 6 years of feeling like I was still running from something, still waiting for the ground to give way again. And now, Caleb asked, now I feel like I've finally stopped running. Evelyn said, turning to face him fully, something radiant and certain shining in her expression that had nothing to do with fear or survival, and everything to do with a future she'd never quite let herself imagine before. Like I've finally found somewhere solid enough to stand still. They returned to the homestead as true partners in every sense the word could hold, and the community of Bitter Creek, having witnessed firsthand the courage and competence Evelyn had shown throughout the entire ordeal, welcomed her with a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the whispered cruelty of that first day on the train platform. Mrs. Petrie herself, the rancher's wife, whose careless remark had first cut Evelyn on arrival, sought her out at the following month's church social with an apology that, while awkward, carried genuine remorse. "I judged you wrong that first day," Mrs. Petrie admitted, twisting her hands together with visible discomfort. "Called you a workhorse like you were livestock instead of a person, and I've felt shame over it ever since, watching everything you've done for this town. Watching you stand up to a man most of our husbands would have been too frightened to cross." "Apology accepted," Evelyn said, and meant it, because whatever bitterness she might once have carried had transformed somewhere over the difficult, extraordinary months since her arrival into something closer to compassion for a woman who'd simply repeated the same casual cruelty the world had taught her to expect from strangers before circumstances proved otherwise. By early summer, the homestead had transformed further still, a proper garden flourishing where only scrub grass had grown before new fencing. Caleb and 2 hired hands had built to expand their grazing land, now that the boundary dispute had been permanently and legally settled in their favor. And inside the cabin itself, small touches everywhere that spoke of a home built by 2 people rather than one man's solitary survival. It was on a warm evening in July, the 2 of them sitting together on the porch swing Caleb had built, watching the sun set, gold and pink over the mountains that had once seemed so forbidding to a frightened woman stepping off a train, that Evelyn finally found the courage to voice something she'd been carrying quietly for weeks. "Caleb," she said softly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know it doesn't change anything between us, whatever it means for the future." His expression shifted to careful attention, the same steady patience she'd come to rely on completely. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." "The doctor in Bitter Creek," she said slowly. "The one I saw last month when I thought I'd caught some kind of stomach illness that wouldn't pass." She paused, watching his face, carefully gauging his reaction before continuing. "He told me the injuries from before, the ones that Doctor in Cheyenne said would prevent children entirely. He said, sometimes doctors are wrong about the extent of such damage. Said sometimes what looks impossible turns out only to have been unlikely, not impossible after all." Caleb went very still, understanding dawning slow, and then all at once. "Evelyn." "I'm expecting Caleb. Come this winter if everything holds the way the doctor expects." Her voice trembled with an emotion too complex to name, simply hope and fear and disbelief and joy, all tangled together after years of believing this particular dream had been stolen from her permanently. "I know it doesn't change what happened before, doesn't erase any of it, but I wanted you to know because—" Whatever else she meant to say was lost, as Caleb pulled her into his arms with a sound that was half laugh, half something raw and more overwhelmed, holding her like something precious and impossible all at once. "A baby," he said, voice thick, hand moving to rest gentle against her still flat stomach, like he could hardly believe what she'd just told him. "Evelyn, a baby. After everything that man tried to take from you." The doctor cautioned, "It's no guarantee," said complications could still arise given everything before. "But he said the possibility exists, which is more than I ever let myself hope for these 6 years past." "Whatever happens," Caleb said fiercely, pulling back enough to look her directly in the eyes. "Whatever the doctor's caution means for how this unfolds, I want you to hear me plain right now. You are not defined by whether you carry this child to term any more than you were ever defined by that scar or that cruel man's lies about your worth. You are already everything I could ever want in this life. Evelyn Whitaker, with or without a baby come winter. But I'll tell you true. The thought of a child with your sand and your sharp mind growing up on this mountain, knowing nothing but love from both of us, That's about the finest thing I've let myself imagine since Sarah. Evelyn wept then, but the tears carried nothing but joy and overwhelming gratitude. 6 years of grief finally giving way to something she genuinely believed impossible when she'd stepped off that train back in the dead of winter, terrified and certain of her own unworthiness. The winter that followed brought both hardship and miracle in equal measure, a difficult pregnancy that tested every ounce of strength Evelyn had built across the preceding year, complications that had both of them holding their breath through long, anxious nights. Caleb refusing to leave her side, even when the doctor from Bitter Creek insisted rest alone would serve her better than his anxious presence. But when the child finally arrived on a cold February morning, healthy and strong, despite every fear that had preceded her birth, Caleb Whitaker held his daughter for the first time with hands that shook not from cold or exhaustion, but from a joy so complete it left him briefly entirely speechless. "What'll we call her?" he finally managed, voice rough with emotion. Watching Evelyn cradle their daughter against her chest, with an expression of pure, unguarded wonder. "Sarah," Evelyn said softly, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "If that's all right with you." Seemed fitting, somehow honoring the family you built before, while starting the one we're building now. Caleb couldn't speak past the emotion closing his throat, could only nod and press a kiss to Evelyn's forehead, then to their daughter's understanding, in that single unguarded moment that every fear he'd carried onto that train platform over a year before, every wall he'd built around his own grief, believing it would protect him from ever hurting that badly again, had been worth tearing down entirely for exactly this. A family rebuilt, not despite loss, but somehow impossibly, because two broken people had chosen each other anyway, and in choosing had made each other whole. By the following spring, the story of Caleb and Evelyn Whitaker had become something of local legend throughout the territory, not merely the tale of a fraud scheme exposed and justice finally served, but the story of a mail-order bride who'd arrived broken by circumstances beyond her control and had proven time and again that her worth had never been diminished by scars either visible or hidden. Young women arriving on similar arrangements throughout the territory would sometimes hear whispered versions of the tale offered as quiet encouragement that whatever fear or shame they carried onto unfamiliar platforms need not define the life waiting for them on the other side of that fear. Evelyn herself, when asked occasionally by curious townsfolk about the scars she no longer hid beneath careful layers of clothing, answered with a steadiness that would have been impossible for the trembling woman who'd stepped off that train over a year before. "These scars," she'd say, "are proof I survived something that should have broken me. Proof I kept walking forward anyway, even when every voice around me insisted I wasn't worth the effort. I don't hide them anymore because hiding them would mean agreeing with the people who told me they made me less. They don't. They never did. They simply mean I know exactly how strong I truly am, in ways I might never have discovered without surviving what I survived." Caleb, listening to her speak this way to a young bride newly arrived in the territory one autumn afternoon, felt the same swell of pride and love that had become as constant and certain in his chest as his own heartbeat. He thought back sometimes to that first day on the platform, the shy, frightened woman who wouldn't meet his eyes, whom he'd judged too fragile for mountain life, before she'd even spoken a full sentence to him. He thought of how wrong he'd been and how grateful he remained. Every single day since that circumstance and stubborn courage had proven that first judgment false. The mountain that had once represented only solitary survival to Caleb Whitaker had transformed through Evelyn's presence and partnership into something he genuinely believed lost to him forever after Sarah's death. A true home full of laughter and small daily joys. A daughter growing stronger every season. And a marriage built not on desperate necessity, but on a love neither of them had expected to find. Forged through storms, both literal and figurative, that could easily have destroyed something less resilient than what they'd built together. Evelyn Carter. Whitaker had arrived on that mountain believing herself broken beyond any hope of real love, carrying secrets and scars she was certain would send any decent man running the moment he discovered the truth of her past. Instead, she had found in Caleb Whitaker a partner who saw those scars not as evidence of damage, but as testament to a resilience and strength that had ultimately saved them both from Doyle's fraud, from Caleb's own frozen grief, from the isolation that had defined both their lives before fate, however reluctantly, had brought them together on a cold train platform in the depths of a Montana winter. Their story, whispered and shared throughout the territory in the years that followed, carried within it a truth neither of them had fully understood when they'd first exchanged wary, uncertain vows in front of a preacher who doubted the match would survive its first hard winter. That the deepest, most enduring love rarely arrives as fireworks and easy romance, but instead grows slow and steady through shared hardship, through choosing each other again and again in the face of storms, both natural and man-made, through the simple, profound act of seeing past someone's wounds to the extraordinary strength that had carried them through surviving those wounds in the first place. The mountain man, who had once believed himself complete with nothing more than solitude and survival, had learned through the shy bride. He'd almost turned away. That true strength lay not in needing no one, but in having the courage to need someone completely and to be needed in return. And the woman who had arrived, believing herself too broken for love, had discovered through his patient, unwavering devotion that her scars had never been the sum of who she was, but merely the proof of every battle she had already won on her way to finding a home and a love that would never again make her question her own worth. Their homestead stood strong through every winter that followed, weathering storms of every kind with the same resilience that had first brought them together. And their love, tested by fire and fraud, and the deepest fears either had carried into that first uncertain meeting, only grew steadier and more unshakable with every season that passed, proof enough for anyone who doubted it that even the most wounded hearts could find against every expectation a love strong enough to heal them completely.